welcome to Anatomy and Physiology's Chapter 10. And with this chapter, yet again, we are just hopping from organ system to organ system. And with this chapter, we're in the muscular system. And like always, before we even get started, you already know some things about this system already. Way back from Chapter 1, remember this system is made up of muscles, and muscles help us to move. And you even know a little bit more about this chapter already, because when we talk about muscles, like any other organ system, tissues come back. And so we're talking about tissues as well. But no worries, you know a lot about the tissues. It's the same three tissues we saw before when we looked at tissues. It's skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. And so as we go through this chapter and this organ system, like usual, we're going to look at this organ system microscopically, which is what we're going to do in Chapter 10. And then we're going to look at it macroscopically, looking at the organs in Chapter 11. So we're going to start off first with the tissues. And again, you know a lot of this already. It's the same three tissues we saw before. It's skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. Again, just think back to when we did tissues. You know already. For example, when we looked at skeletal muscle tissues under the microscope, it had those alternating light and dark bands. Remember, we call those striations. So we say skeletal muscle tissue is striated. It has those alternating light and dark bands. What else? Think back. We saw this tissue. When we looked at each cell, a single cell could have more than one nucleus. And you remember the nuclei looked like they were pushed to the edges or the periphery of the cell. So we say skeletal muscle tissue has multiple peripheral nuclei. Or we say it's multinucleated, meaning it has multiple nuclei. And where did we find this tissue? Remember, it told us in the name. It's called skeletal muscle tissue because it's found in skeletal muscles, the organs, which are muscles we use to move. And because we use them to move, we control them. You remember when you control a muscle tissue, we say it's voluntary. So you can see, you knew all this from tissues already. None of that was new. You already knew skeletal muscle tissue was striated. It had multiple peripheral nuclei. It's located in skeletal muscles, which are attached to your skeleton to help you to move. And you control it. It's voluntary. So let's remind ourselves about the other two types of muscle tissue, like cardiac muscle tissue. Remember, it actually tells you in the name where to find it. Remember, it's called cardiac for cardia, which is heart. Remember, you find cardiac muscle tissue located in the heart. And the heart's there to help pump blood around your body, to help send oxygen and nutrients. And remember, do you have to tell your heart when to beat? Oh, I hope not. Why? Because you don't control this tissue. It's involuntary. But remember, it did look a little bit like skeletal muscle tissue. How? Remember, when you looked at cardiac muscle tissue under the microscope, it also had those alternating light and dark bands. It also had striations. But every once in a while, we saw a really dark-looking band, almost looked like a dark striation. Remember, those weren't striations. Those individual dark-looking bands we saw scattered about were intercalated discs. Remember, intercalated discs are just part gap junction. They're allowing cells to communicate via electricity and send nutrients, primarily to help make sure all the cells beat at once. Remember, you want your heart and all the cells in the heart to contract at the same time. So they're using all the gap junctions located in the intercalated discs to help send that signal. But again, keep it simple. Cardiac muscle tissue, striated. Remember, when you look at the cells in cardiac muscle tissue, they only have one nucleus, sometimes two, but stick to one if I were to ask. Remember, it's located in the heart, and you do not control it. It's involuntary. And then the last type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue. Remember, it's called smooth because when you looked at it, it did not have those alternating light and dark bands. It did not have striations. It was non-striated, meaning there were no striations. And remember, where do you find this tissue? Well, you find it in places like hollow organs. Think your intestines or your blood vessels. They will have some smooth muscle inside to help with movement. And remember, think intestines. You don't have to tell your food when to move around inside your intestines. Why? Because you don't control smooth muscle tissue either. It's also involuntary, just like cardiac muscle tissue. So as we go through this microscopic part of the chapter, we're just really focusing on the tissues here. And to keep things simple, from here on out, as we progress, we're only talking about skeletal muscle tissue. Because you saw from our previous chart and what we already know about our tissues, they are not the same. So if you were to look at each individual type of cell up close, a skeletal muscle cell, a cardiac muscle cell, a smooth muscle cell, they will not actually look the same. So to help keep everyone from getting a little confused and overwhelmed, we're just going to focus on one for this chapter. We're going to focus on skeletal muscle tissue. So from here on out, as you go through the rest of this chapter and this lecture, just stick in your mind that you're only talking about skeletal muscle tissue. And we'll use this because in chapter 11, we're going to be looking at skeletal muscles, the organs. So we're going to look at the tissues first. And again, tissues are just one level of your whole body. Remember, you have multiple levels to you: a chemical level, a cellular level, tissue, organ, etc. And so we're going to attack this at really two major levels: the cellular, or really three: cellular, tissue, and muscle level. So you could imagine, what would I want or need if I wanted to make a muscle cell, or a skeletal muscle organ? Well, it could begin with the cell. Remember, you have a cellular level. So if I wanted to build a muscle, all I really need is a lot of muscle cells. And that's what you see on this chart here, or this picture here. To build a muscle, it begins first with a single muscle cell. And by the way, in case you're using different textbooks, there are lots of names for a muscle cell. You could call it a muscle cell, or a myocyte, MYOCYTE, or a muscle fiber. These are all synonyms: muscle cell, myocyte, or muscle fiber. But looking at this chart, look all the way towards the bottom. We're looking at one individual muscle cell kind of pulled out in the image. And all you're doing to make the muscle is gathering lots of cells. But you got to think, you got to hold these cells together. And the thing that's going to hold these cells together is connective tissue. So as we talk about how you're using this cell or cells to build a muscle, we got to talk about all the connective tissue that's holding and covering all these structures and keeping them in place. I want you to know the three major connective tissue coverings that we find in skeletal muscle. I'll mention their names first and then go one by one like usual. The three connective tissue coverings are endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium. Those are the three connective tissue coverings. I want you to know the three coverings, and it's simply, what are they covering? So let's build this muscle. So if I want to build a muscle, again, I'm going to get my muscle cell, aka my muscle fiber, which is what they call it in this picture. And then I'm going to surround that individual cell actually with connective tissue. This is not the same thing as the plasma membrane. This is going to be connective tissue sitting on top or outside, more superficial to the plasma membrane. And it's called endomysium. Endomysium is the connective tissue that covers a single muscle cell. Keep it that simple. But again, we got to build our muscle. I need more than one cell. So you're going to grab a collection of cells. A collection of cells in anatomy is what we call a fascicle. It's a bundle of cells. In this case, a bundle of muscle cells is called a fascicle. And you're going to have to keep this fascicle together. You're going to have to keep these cells together. So again, we're going to need some more connective tissue. And there's going to be connective tissue wrapped around the fascicle, surrounding this collection of cells, and we call it perimysium. Again, like usual, keep it simple. Perimysium is the connective tissue covering for a fascicle, or a collection of muscle cells. And then to build the entire muscle organ, well, you're going to get a lot of these fascicles together. You're going to get a lot of these bundles of muscle cells. And you're going to need to keep all these fascicles together. You're going to need to keep the entire muscle organ together. And like usual, you're going to use your connective tissue covering to do it again. So the last bit is epimysium. It's going to be surrounding the entire muscle to hold everything together. So that's a little bit on how you make a muscle. There's a bit more involved, but basically, if you think about it of the cells in the muscle, it's just how do you hold them together? And it's going to be these connective tissue coverings helping to do it. One more time, it's going to be endomysium surrounding a single muscle cell, perimysium, which surrounds a fascicle or a collection of muscle cells, and epimysium, which is going to surround the entire muscle. And that's how you're going to build it up from these individual cells. But again, in this chapter, we're not going to focus on muscles, the organs. We'll do that in chapter 11. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the cells themselves. And again, remember, everything we're talking about right now is just skeletal muscle. So where do skeletal muscle cells come from? Well, like any other cell in your body, they start off as very immature cells. We call them myoblasts. And when you look at a myoblast, individual immature cells, muscle cells, actually only have one nucleus. And it's the way they get multiple nuclei is that these cells actually fuse together as they mature into a bigger muscle cell. So whenever you look at a mature skeletal muscle cell with all its peripheral nuclei, you're really seeing the nuclei of every individual immature cell before they fuse together. Like usual, stick to the exam review. And so we're going to look at a skeletal muscle cell up close. We're going to look at a myocyte up close, a muscle fiber up close. Remember, those are all synonyms. And like usual, you know stuff already. It's just a cell. And like all cells, it has those three basic parts to it. It has a plasma membrane, that outer boundary, holding in everything inside, aka the cytoplasm, and it has at least one nucleus. We know it's skeletal muscle tissue or skeletal muscle cells. They have more than one nuclei. It's just that as we talk about different parts of this cell, the names are going to change to help be more specific. For example, I mentioned your skeletal muscle cell has a plasma membrane, but its name changes to help us be specific. Remember, our anatomists want you to know specifically what they're talking about. So instead of saying, hey class, let's look at the plasma membrane of a skeletal muscle cell, I could just say, let's look at the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is just the name for the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. And in this picture, you see it as this light blue outer covering to the cell. That's just the plasma membrane. We just happen to call it sarcolemma. And it's still doing the usual work. It's holding everything inside, and everything inside is the cytoplasm. But again, the name changes. The cytoplasm is called the sarcoplasm. Okay. So the sarcoplasm is just another name for the cytoplasm, specifically for a muscle cell. What else? It's a normal cell, so we'll find some regular organelles in there. For example, when you look at a muscle cell, you'll actually find lots of mitochondria. Why? Because it takes energy to move, and you remember your mitochondria make energy. You see them as the little orange jelly bean looking structures. They're still the mitochondria. What else? Your muscle cell also has a large endoplasmic reticulum, but we don't break up the endoplasmic reticulum into a rough and smooth in skeletal muscle. And its name is going to change. The endoplasmic reticulum of your skeletal muscle cell is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And not only is its name different, its function is different. Remember, we don't break it up into a rough and smooth. Why? Because it's actually not helping to make proteins like rough ER, and it's not really making fats or helping with detoxification like smooth ER. It actually has its own function. I want you to know the function of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Its one major function is to store and release calcium. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, you can see in this picture, is this large orange lattice work, this whole orange network. See, kind of all around, scattered around. That's the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's like a big storage container for calcium, because we'll see later on when we talk about how you actually move, calcium plays a huge role in it. So your cells need it around, so they store